Welcome to the Australian Hiker Podcast, Australia's longest running hiking podcast, downloaded over 1.2 million times worldwide and providing you with an Australian perspective on all things hiking. We're your hosts, Tim and Jill Savage, coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country.
In this week's episode 334, brought to you by Whipper, Australia's pack manufacturer, we talked to New Zealand hiker Jonty Crane about his adventure on the Indian-based Ladakh Sky Trail. We hope you enjoy. If you'd like to help support Australian Hiker and this podcast, there are a couple of ways that you can help us out. Firstly, by subscribing on your podcast host of choice so that each episode is available as soon as it's published. And if you have the opportunity, leave us a 5-star review. Another way to support us is go to the Australian Hiker website at www.australianhiker.com.au and click on the Support Us page and buy us a coffee. You can do a one-off donation or become a monthly supporter. All donations are greatly appreciated and help us to continue producing this podcast and blog. Now let's get on to today's episode. Over the past 18 months, we have caught up with New Zealand hiker Jonty Crane about several of his adventures, many of which are on trails that fall outside the norm. Today's interview is no different as we talk to Jonty about the Ladakh Sky Trail in northern India, a trail that is classed as strenuous with altitudes reaching over 5,000 metres. Jonty, thanks for taking the time to chat with us on your adventure.
Always a pleasure.
So before we talk about our trip, you've come on Australian Hiker Podcast a couple of times previously, but for those that don't know you, give us a bit of general background about yourself and your hiking resume.
Sure. So I'm a New Zealander and I'm currently volunteering in Suva in Fiji, which is through Volunteer Service Abroad, which is the New Zealand equivalent of Australia Volunteers International. And so, I'm talking to you from Fiji. But in terms of my hiking side of things, so I became a hiker. My accent will give away that I was kind of born in the UK, but I moved to New Zealand in 2010. And that's really when I started hiking. It seems it's the national sport in New Zealand. So I thought, well, I've moved here, I ought to give it a go. And I kind of fell in love with tramping, as we'd call it there. And since then, I've done multi-day hikes on 5 continents, including in Ethiopia, Papua New Guinea, Bhutan, Albania. In Australia, I've done the Larapinta Trail and the Kangaroo Island Wilderness Trails as well, and lots of tramping around New Zealand. So I've done a reasonable amount of hiking in a reasonable amount of quite different places. And I also do a little bit of podcasting relating to hiking in New Zealand. So I've just started a podcast called The Tramping Life, and that's really focused on hiking in New Zealand. I've spoke to a mother and daughter, and they walked the length of New Zealand when she was 7 years old, and spoke to a pair of artists who are inspired by the huts that we have in the New Zealand backcountry, and they make these mini huts, which you can buy as like kind of little works of art, little corrugated and wood models of the huts. So that's keeping me busy when I'm not hiking or volunteering.
Now, tell me, just before we progress on, I think last time we talked to you, you were going to be going to Samoa, I believe.
Yes, things are good, well remembered. So things have changed a little bit. That was we're looking to go to Samoa, and it didn't quite work out. So we've ended up in Fiji, which is kind of same but different. It is actually more different than one might think. If you look at kind of Pacific Islands from afar, they can look a bit similar with the coconut trees and the beaches, but actually spending a bit of time, particularly given the Polynesian versus the Melanesian cultures, and just the size and scale of things, they are quite different experiences. But I've been in Suva now for 4 months. It's in the wet season now, so it's a good time to do some podcasting.
Okay. Now, in podcasting as well, I think last time we talked to you as well, you were doing a series or a podcast on East Timor or Timor-Leste, and now you said you've got the Tramping Life, and that's I'm assuming that's focused purely on New Zealand hikes, is it?
Correct.
And you're still doing the Timor-Leste one, or that's pretty much you've done the series for that?
Yeah, I mean, I've had 25 episodes. It's called Exploring Timor-Leste. I think I covered off most topics. It's a relatively small country. I've got episodes about hiking. I've got, is it safe to visit Timor-Leste? I've talked about all different regions of Timor-Leste. I've interviewed a few people, but it's a relatively niche kind of podcast. And the tramping one it's a slightly different format to yours, Sim, that I'm more interviewing, well-known trampers or people with a strong kind of tramping connection or conservationists about their kind of life story and involvement in tramping. So it's not kind of really focused on individual tracks. It's really just diving into people's backgrounds. I spoke to one of New Zealand's leading cavers, so he does all this kind of caving underground, does some paragliding, lots of conservationists and politicians. So it's it's a different kind of thing in the kind of hiking podcast genre, I guess.
Okay, and we'll put a link to that podcast in the show notes for the people that are interested. Now let's get on to the Ladakh. I'm not quite sure if you pronounce it that way, the Ladakh Sky Trail. This is a destination that most Australians would never have heard of. So can you provide us an overview of this trail, just to give us an indication of what we're looking at?
Sure. So Ladakh, as I'd call it, is the northernmost region of India. So it's the Indian Himalaya. It borders Kashmir, but it thankfully doesn't have the same security issues that Kashmir's had. Ladakh's been a pretty kind of quiet place, particularly in relation to Kashmir. So it's part of the Great Himalayan Range, and there's over a dozen mountains which are over 7,000 meters high. So it's some pretty big mountain landscapes. And Ladakh is actually a high altitude desert. So it gets less than 10 centimeters of rain a year. It's a very rocky, barren landscape, but it is home to some very large rivers. So the Indus River, which I think starts probably up in Tibet and then kind of comes through Ladakh and then goes into Pakistan, and then you've got the Shylock and the Zanskar rivers as well, which are fed by glaciers. So it's this kind of interesting contrast, a very dry landscape, but there's a lot of water going through it, but actually the rivers are very silty and it doesn't tend to translate into greenery. There are places with irrigation and some green areas, but in general we've got this kind of really kind of quite... if you're a geologist, actually on the trip I did, there was a geologist in our group, and he was loving it. It's a geologist's dream in terms of the kind of rock formations you see in the different colours and things in the landscape. So it's part of the Himalaya, but it's quite different to, say, most of Nepal, or certainly it's similar to Western Nepal, but most people go to kind of central eastern Nepal, and it's quite a different kind of landscape to that. And that historically, Ladakh has been part of India since the mid-19th century. It was one of a number of kind of Himalayan kingdoms like Zanskar and Sikkim, and they were incorporated into India while China took over Tibet. And then due to British and Indian support, Nepal and Bhutan have remained independent countries. So if you look back at the Himalaya region 300-400 years ago, you would have had a half a dozen kind of sovereign kingdoms, but due to geopolitics, they've kind of merged down really into kind of India, China, and then Nepal and Bhutan. So Ladakh borders both Pakistan and China. So I said it is safe. There isn't the security issues of Kashmir, but there is a lot of Indian Army bases up there, including the airport is an Indian Army kind of airport. So you will see a lot of kind of troop trucks and things going around, which to me just adds to the appeal in some ways, because it's not often you go hiking and you're kind of going past major kind of military bases and seeing what's kind of going on. Now the trip itself, the Ladakh Sky Trail, this was developed by Olmas Khan, so he's the trip leader. He's been running this trip for maybe 15, 20 years. And he was born in India, but he lives in Tasmania. So he's Australian, he's a member of the fire service for a long time, so he very much understands Australians and probably Kiwis and Westerners, but he was born in India, so he also understands India. And so he's really a great conduit between the local crew and the guests that come on these trips. And this trip is a kind of one-off trip. So what he's been doing over the last 20 years, kind of returning to Ladakh, is he's tried to make the best kind of itinerary with the best kind of trails. But every time he returns, as if you've been to Nepal or other areas in the Himalaya, the roads and the development is relentless. The hiking trails that were amazing 10, 15 years ago are now quite busy roads. And so then you have to go to look for other trails. So he actually keeps revising the itinerary to keep it obscure and off the beaten track and make sure it's quite remote. There are some quite popular hikes or relatively popular hikes in Ladakh, which are kind of like the Ladakhi equivalent of the Annapurna circuit. When the Annapurna circuit, people really discovered it. It was just a trail, and now there's a road all the way around. So you do have to be careful with the Himalaya. That you might have heard of a trail 10, 15 years ago. Chances are it's probably changed quite significantly by now. So the trail itself, or the kind of combination of trails, it's effectively sort of 3 treks of different lengths kind of put together. It's in total about 160 kilometers, and it takes about 18 days to walk the whole thing. And so it's not you start from one point, you walk for 3 weeks and you finish. Instead, you start in Leh, which is the capital Ladakh region, and you do a number of short walks to acclimatise, because Leh, I think, is about 3,500 metres above sea level, and so altitude is a consideration. So you start doing some short walks there, then you do a sort of half-day hike, then you do a really good 4-day hike through a very, very remote valley kind of canyon area, and you'll see almost nobody. And then there's and then you drive for maybe half a day or a day, and then you do a sort of 12-day trek to kind of finish the itinerary. So it's a little bit different to your typical kind of, you just start hiking, then you kind of finish. The trail is quite rocky. It's similar, I think, to the Larapinta. The highest pass is nearly 5,500 meters above sea level, so that's pretty high. And most of the trip, you're going to be around kind of 4,000 meters above sea level.
So just a couple of questions that came out of that. Given there's only 10 centimetres of rainfall a year, is there snow in the middle of winter?
There are some massive glaciers, and there is a lot of snow. So one of the highlights of the trip in some ways was actually just getting to Ladakh and flying up from Delhi. And you fly over the Ladakh region, and there's some of the biggest glaciers outside of the polar areas are around there. There is, I guess, because of the altitude, when the snow does fall, it's going to freeze, it's going to stay there. And then over the course of the sort of spring, that's when you get the sort of flood melt of water coming through, and the rivers are raging. And then kind of summer, when you do the hike, the rivers hopefully have calmed down a little bit, and then you're getting into kind of the autumn, winter, when the rain that there is there will come and bring the snow back.
Okay, and you mentioned that the trails are now busy roads, and I suppose from the little time that I've spent in that sort of area, typically you pass a lot of the locals, and that's their foot road, I suppose. And is that what these roads have been, where it was the locals walking from village to village or area to area, and that it was just a logical place to put a road? Correct.
And I guess when people are walking, they're going to try and find the easiest path to walk. And when you're building a road, you want to find the easiest place to build the road. And Ladakh is really a landscape of, there's not a lot of flat sections, let's put it that way. It's not like the Tibetan Plateau. The Ladakh and the Himalayas, which are one of the newest mountain ranges in the world, there's a lot of activity. And so there's a lot of canyons and gorges. And so your options are pretty limited. Basically, you're going to walk along the canyon or gorge, or you're going to have to go over some passes. So, there's not that many options when it comes to kind of path and road building. And certainly say that's a lot of the trails that are used on this trek are used by the locals. I mean, in fact, the 4-day one, which is very remote, even the locals don't walk through there. It's pretty much like there might be, I almost say, there might be 2 or 3 sets of yak herders go through there each year, but it's pretty minimal in terms of the foot traffic.
How did you end up doing this trail? I mean, and you do seem to have a penchant for doing the out of the ordinary sort of trails. You typically aren't doing the trails that everybody else is doing, which is a good thing, because we get to hear about some really unique sort of trails. But how did you come across this one, and how did you decide this is the one we're going to do?
Yeah, I mean, I have done things like Tour de Mont Blanc, but it's hard once you've done something where you pretty much have it to yourself to then go back to the trails with lots of people. So I definitely have a preference, but yeah, these obscure trails are a bit of a speciality. So I think I first came across this online maybe like a decade ago, and at the time it just seemed like this incredible thing that I would never do. And so I had it in the sort of back of my bucket list as a general vague thought, and then it kind of got to the point where I was like, well, actually, I've now got the skills and capability and kind of experience to do a trip like this. And I actually went to Ladakh in 2019 as an overland trip. So we started in Delhi and we headed north. We went up to where the Dalai Lama lives, we went to Shimla, and then we headed up overland up to Ladakh, which was definitely easier from an acclimatization perspective because I wasn't walking and I was in a car. But the Ladakh environment, like the culture and monasteries and the Buddhism, was just fascinating. So I really thought, okay, well, this is great. I've been to Ladakh, I really enjoyed it, but I didn't get to do any hiking. And I had this kind of a memory of the Ladakh Sky Trail. So I thought I'd go and check that out. And I've been trying to explore the Himalaya, the different parts of the Himalaya. So I've now been to Pakistan, India twice, Nepal twice, and Bhutan. And it's fascinating to see the variety of landscapes and the differences. Like Bhutan is very forested and very wet, and then Pakistan, India is kind of the opposite end under the kind of rain shadow, so it's a lot drier kind of environment. And then also the similarities. So Tibetan Buddhism and that Tibetan culture, which has really been under a lot of threat and stress, I guess, in Tibet with the Chinese kind of occupation of Tibet. A lot of that Tibetan culture is almost stronger now outside of Tibet. So as I say, the Dalai Lama lives in India. If you go to the Ladakh region and some northern areas of Nepal and Bhutan, you can really see kind of Tibetan Buddhism kind of as it was, and that's just fascinating to explore.
Okay, and what time of the year did you do this trip? And is it one of these ones that you can do at any time of the year, or there's a
Yes, it's the opposite of that. You can do it once a year, and there's a very small window of opportunity. So, as I've been touched on before, in the spring, there's a lot of snowmelt, so the rivers are just impassable. And there are probably 40 or 50 river crossings on this trip, so you want the water level to be kind of low enough, but you want to avoid the fresh snow falling. So unlike Nepal, where you've got a spring and autumn season, in Ladakh and also kind of Pakistan, the summer is the time you go hiking, which there are pros and cons about. So, I mean, it's an even shorter window, so you're looking at probably 2, maybe 3 months at max. So all the people who are going to come are probably going to come within that window. So some of the places can get quite busy. You're also looking, it can be quite hot. So it could easily get to 30 degrees plus. And so the landscape's quite barren. There's almost no trees. So there's not a lot of shade. Unless you're kind of, if the sun's behind the mountains, it's pretty. And as soon as the sun comes over the mountains, like that's it for the day, you're going to be pretty toasty. So, but then at night, it might have got below freezing, but not very much below freezing. And certainly compared to the hikes I've done in Nepal and Bhutan, which tend to be later in the year, this was definitely not as cold. I mean, when you're 5,000 meters, it's going to be cold, whatever kind of time of year you're doing it. But it definitely was, the temperature was on the warmer end of that season. A bit like the Larapinta in some ways. You know, the Larapinta is really hot in the day and it's a desert, so it's really cold at night. So it's probably a similar kind of climate to that. And it was quite nice hiking in the summer because you get long days. So the sunset would be around, say, 7 p.m. Whereas typically when I go hiking in Nepal in November, the sun probably sets at maybe 5 p.m. because of the mountains. It's gone by 2:30, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So it's quite nice to get to a campsite and actually have some time in the sunshine rather than getting to the campsite and then you're instantly in the shade and it's getting cold already.
Okay. Now, this was an organised trip, and I believe you went with a mountain company who you've used previously. Why pick the mountain company, and how was the structure of the trips they tend to run?
And the simple answer is they're the only ones who run the trip. So that's one reason for using them. Let's say I've done 3 other hikes with them in the Himalayas. So I did the Snowman Trek in Bhutan, did the Kanchenjunga circuit and the Manaslu circuit in Nepal with them. And so they're the only ones who run this itinerary. They've got a very good safety record. They're very organised, very responsive. They're very small. It's basically a one-man band. The owner is a guy called Roland, who is British. And so you know exactly what to expect. It's not like a World Expeditions where it's a big operation with lots of people. Here it's like, okay, Roland, I've got some questions. He's very responsive to answering those. So that's quite nice to have that kind of connection there. They generally veer on the side of safety. So some of their itineraries tend to be a bit longer than other companies because they allow a bit more time for acclimatization. They're generally a little bit more expensive because they will bring more equipment. For example, they always bring safety equipment. So, for example, a portable hyperbaric bag, which they can use in case of altitude. So if you get issues with altitude sickness, which is definitely a risk in Ladakh, you can go in the bag and they can adjust the altitude by up to 1,000 meters, which makes a real difference, particularly when it can make life or death difference, basically. And then that gives people the opportunity to deal with the altitude before a helicopter or other things can kind of get to them.
So in relation to cost on this trip, so what was the total length of the trip as opposed to the day's hiking? And just an indicative idea of what the cost of the trip was.
Yeah, so it's 23 days in total, and then you've got 18 days of hiking because you've got time getting to and from Leh, and you've got some days where you're visiting monasteries and you're doing smaller stuff rather than hiking. Now, that trip costs about 7,500 Australian dollars, and that basically includes everything. So your food, tents, accommodation, crew, you pretty much need to spend no money. Once you get yourself to Leh, then you're kind of looked after well for the next 23 days. I was looking at flights from Australia through to Leh. It's probably about $2,000 return. It didn't seem too crazy. It seemed like you can get to Delhi relatively easily. And then there's quite a lot of sort of budget airlines that fly from Delhi up to Ladakh. It's interesting now, having done these hikes across the Himalaya, in terms of the pricing. So my experience is that Ladakh is, on average, roughly about twice as expensive as Nepal, because it is more remote. The season is shorter. There's less hiking infrastructure. There's no kind of tea houses in place, but it is about a third cheaper than Bhutan. So Bhutan's about 6 times more expensive than Nepal, which probably kind of makes sense when you look at some of the price stickers for some of the trips in Bhutan, and the fact they've got that kind of tourist tax coming on. It's an amazing place. It's if you can afford it, it's a great place to go. But it's and it has got more expensive recently. And Nepal is definitely the most kind of cost effective of those 3 countries. And then sort of Ladakh's kind of in between the two, really.
Now, I was going to say, from that, in relation to the flights, was this something that you had to organise, or did the mountaineering company or the mountain company also help you with that as well?
Yeah, they're not a travel agency. They're a hiking company. So they're like, get yourself to Leh, and then they'll look after you. So you just have to book your flights to Leh. Now, the only challenge with Leh is, unless you're flying probably Air India, it's quite difficult to get a co-share ticket all the way through to Leh from wherever you're leaving from. So generally, you'll get a ticket to Delhi, and then have an overnight stay in Delhi, or a couple of days stay in Delhi, just in case there's any kind of issues with flight delays, and then fly on to Leh. And I quite enjoyed that. Like, I've been to Delhi a few times now. It's a fascinating and enthralling and exhausting experience. And so it's actually quite good just to experience it in like 1 or 2 day chunks. I think if I had a week in Delhi, it would be too much, but it's quite nice to have a little bit of Delhi kind of history and culture. And it makes you almost appreciate more when you're hiking in the middle of nowhere, to know that a few days before you're in one of the biggest cities in the world, and it's a really kind of intense experience. So, but there's plenty of flights. There's actually 15 flights a day now from Delhi up to Ladakh, and it's only an hour and a half flight. So it's very scenic. You fly over glaciers. You really see the contrast. So you leave Delhi, and it is the scale of it you can't comprehend unless you're in the air. And even from the air, you're like, this is just, for every direction you can see, is just buildings and habitation. And then you start getting out across the kind of the more countryside areas, and they've got like the crops, and you've got some villages, and then you start getting up into the mountains. So you get a lot of kind of variety just within that flight. Then Leh itself is almost, if you've never been to Leh, I'd almost recommend actually adding a couple of extra days beyond the itinerary, because Leh is just a lovely, lovely place to visit. The climate at that time of year in the kind of summer is very pleasant. There's lots of Buddhist monasteries nearby. They have managed to do some irrigation there, so you get this real contrast of the kind of the rocky, barren landscape, and then these willow trees along the side of streams, and it's very kind of idyllic. It's actually where the Dalai Lama spends quite a lot of time. So his main home is in Ganj in northern India, but it's quite a humid climate there, and so he actually spends quite a lot of time now in Leh. It's much drier, and it's much better for his health, because it's getting on a little bit. So it's quite an experience, and it's worth spending a bit of time just in Leh before doing the trek itself.
Okay. And I was going to say, I mean, in relation, so once you actually landed at Leh, is where does the trip actually start? Does the tour guide meet you in Leh at the hotel, or are you staying at a specific hotel?
Yeah, so they'll pick you up from the airport and then take you to the hotel, and then you meet up with the crew, and they'll basically take everything from there. And so you have a couple of days in Leh to see some things in Leh, and also do some little day trips out to some of the monasteries, which are, if you like monasteries, it's a really good trip for people who like monasteries, the kind of Buddhist monasteries. They're really, actually the palace in Leh Palace, is very similar to the palace in Lhasa in Tibet. So that's the original home of the Dalai Lama, which is a really amazing building. It's almost identical kind of design to the one in Leh. So you really get that feel of that kind of Tibetan kind of influenced culture. So then from there you do a drive. So I think it was pretty much a day and a half driving with stops to get out to where we started. Now the roads in Ladakh are actually managed by this organization called Border Roads Organization, shortened to BRO. So you see all these references to BRO, and BRO's amazing, and BRO's done this, and BRO is part of the Indian Ministry of Defence. As I say, it's on the border with Pakistan and China, so they want to make sure the roads are good enough that they can get the military vehicles along them. And they've got the best safety signs I've seen anywhere in the world. And it's really good because the scenery is amazing when you do the drive, but you're also looking out for these little green signs, which they have all these little like slogans and catches and things which kind of catch your eye. So some of the ones that stood out to me as you're driving along is love your neighbour, but not while driving. Safety on road, safety at home. Mountains are for pleasure, but if you drive with leisure. Donate blood, but not on the road. Drive like hell, and you will be there. After whiskey, drive risky, and don't gossip, let them drive. So this is quite entertaining.
So as a generalisation, what was the vegetation profile like? Was there any at all, or was this well above the tree line in most cases?
The tree line in Ladakh is probably within 5 meters of some of the streams. There's no it's not like there's any forest or bush really. It's literally the big rivers are just too silty, nothing really grows alongside them. It's a bit surreal. But where they've done some irrigation or some of the smaller streams, then within maybe 5 meters of either on the riverbanks, there can be quite a lot of poplar and willow trees, which were introduced by the British, I believe, in the 19th century. And so they really add a really kind of vibrant green splash of kind of colour to this kind of rocky kind of landscape. And there was more colour in the landscape than I was expecting. Like one of the reasons I was my slight apprehensions about the trip would be it's going to be the same scenery for the whole time. It's going to be rocks and more rocks and more rocks. And actually, it's quite a variety of rocks in terms of the way they're kind of formed and the shapes, but also there was quite a lot of unusual kind of colours in the landscape. And there were some areas with kind of patches of kind of meadow and grass. So, it was definitely more colourful than I was expecting. But, don't expect a huge amount of vegetation.
Yeah, I must admit I had a picture of this as being well above the tree line and not being, as you say, lots of forest. This is given the altitude. I don't think we had many trees when we went to Bhutan. There were some, but it was certainly at the lower altitude. So. And what about animal life? Now, again, a picture I have in mind is maybe the mountain sheep or whatever the equivalent version is there, and maybe some of the farm animals. What did you actually see animal-wise?
Yeah, so blue sheep, they're pretty endemic to the area. You'll see them around. They're actually a bit of a pain because they tend to like jumping around on top of the hillside and knocking rocks down onto you below. So it's kind of a mixed blessing. You're like, it's pretty cool to see some blue sheep. There's a few rocks coming down. So you do have to keep an eye out for them. Yak is the main animal that the locals will herd and will use in those areas. Although, so yak are the main animals you will see around there. It's interesting. All the yak are actually owned by the locals, but they're just let loose. They just let the yak wander off for a week or two, then they might go and collect them, and they sort of gather around a valley, and they just kind of go and collect up the yak as they need them. But otherwise, they can just kind of roam whatever they want. Now, I saw some holes. I'm pretty sure I saw some animal a couple of times, and I said to Almas, I said, what is that? And he said, that's a marmot. And I was like, there's marmots. I was like, I've seen them in the Alps. I wasn't expecting to see them in the Ladakh. So somehow marmots can survive. So that was a bit of an unexpected wildlife sighting. And then something we saw lots of evidence of, but thankfully didn't see in reality, are bears. So the particularly remote kind of 4-day hike we did sort of in the middle of the trip, we saw a lot of fresh bear scat and tracks. Well, thankfully, no bears, because I wouldn't want to see any bears up close. But again, it's quite amazing what can live in these quite remote landscapes.
Okay, yeah. As I said, it was we had blue sheep at when we did the Bhutan trip, and the thing I found annoying about them was they would keep a specific distance. It didn't matter how quietly you crept up on them. You got to a certain point, and the whole herd had moved. So. I did have a telephoto lens, but sometimes you want to get a bit closer in. They just would not let you do it. So.
And what I should mention for a really elusive animal, which it kind of annoys me a bit because a lot of companies will use it as a attraction and a kind of, come to the Ladakh and some areas of Nepal and other spots to see snow leopards. Now, snow leopards are an incredible animal, but they are also incredibly rare, and the chances of seeing a snow leopard is basically zero unless you're going on a dedicated trip to find snow leopards, probably in winter, and then you might have a chance of seeing them. And so a lot of them, they always talk about, oh, the snow leopard lives here. And you're like, yeah, but you're not going to see it. Like, I was speaking to, on my podcast, the episode's not come out yet, but with Peter Hillary, who was the son of Sir Edmund Hillary, who was the first guy to climb Everest with Sherpa or Tenzing. Yeah, he was the first person to climb Everest with Tenzing Norgay. Now, he has spent a lot of time in the mountains. He worked out he'd spent 16 years of his life sleeping under rocks and in huts and things. He's seen a snow leopard twice in 16 years. So you're like, the chances of you popping onto Ladakh in summer and doing a hike and seeing a snow leopard is basically zero. So that's just to manage expectations. There's a lot of hype around it in the publicity materials you read about some of these hikes, but you're just not going to see one.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. And I must admit, I would love to see a snow leopard, but as you say, they're good at what they do. And I've seen some images on them taken from a drone footage where it's been creeping up on an animal, and you think you've got to look really closely to find them. Down at ground level, they're probably almost non-existent, as you say. They're probably there, but we just don't see them. They're good at hiding. Now, this brings us on to the issue of porterage. A lot of the trips through the Himalayas, it will either have porters of some sort, and they'll also have pack animals, either horses or yaks. What was the situation with your hike?
So we had mules carrying all our gear, because there is no supply points on the hikes itself. Between the hikes, so you've got the 4-day hike and then you've got the kind of 12-day hike, then they are able to visit a village or a small town and pick up some supplies. But basically, they need to carry everything. And it's actually interesting having been across the Himalaya now. So in Pakistan and Ladakh and in Bhutan, they tend to use pack animals to carry all your gear, your bags. Nepal seems to be the only one that uses porters, which is great for kind of local employment. It's a good money earner for young guys to carry people's bags, but you do wonder whether it might be better to get a mule to do it sometimes.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. Now, in relation to gear, was there anything outside of the standard hiking gear that you needed to carry for this trip?
So this is standard for the Himalaya, so that might be slightly different to your bush hiking in Australia or even hiking in the Alps in Europe. So you do need to bring some warm layers. Like it can get pretty cold, you're at high altitude. But as I said, it can also get quite hot, so you do need to take some things appropriate for that. But I do swear by poles, and I think they would be pretty much essential for this trip, just given you've got quite a lot of kind of loose rocky surfaces that you might be going up or down. The poles make a real difference just to keeping your balance and giving you a bit more kind of control on those. Actually, something quite specific, which I've only ever used on one other hike, which I've actually also talked to an Australian hiker about, is sports sandals. So first instance, I used them on the Kokoda track in Papua New Guinea because there was quite a lot of river crossings there, which is kind of tropical and you're in the bush. In this case, there's a lot of river crossings, so I do recommend bringing sports sandals for the river crossings. It's really focused on maybe 2 days of the trip involve lots of river crossings. And I said there might be 40 or 50 kind of crossings. Now, these are not generally, thinking about some of the rivers in New Zealand, which can be quite wide. These are generally relatively narrow, but they can be quite fast flowing. And you just do need to take kind of care crossing them. Like, none of our group had any issues, nobody fell over, but the crew are there to help you. You're using your poles. You want to have good kind of river crossing techniques just to make sure that you're safe crossing them. And to be honest, I mean, I was the only person in the group who did this, but I just used my hiking boots because I feel more comfortable in boots than I do in kind of sports sandals. So I would just get my boots wet and I'd do the river crossings. And because it was warm, but also it's so dry. Like it's it's a desert. So it's a very arid environment, which is ideal for drying boots. So if I stuck them in the sun, in the afternoon, they'll basically dry by the next day. I have to say, though, getting your boots wet and dry repeatedly over the course of several days is not the best thing for boots. Now, the pair I took with me were coming towards the end of life, and I remember from the Larapinta that was a bit of a boot destroyer. So the question is, do you take a new pair of boots, which you know will last but will be pretty bunted by the end, or do you take a pair of boots which is already kind of on its way, and then you just kind of kill them on the trek? So that's what I did. So by the end of the trek, my feet were pretty much sticking out of my boots, and so they got thrown away. So, but yeah, most people in the group, they use sports sandals. But then you're kind of crossing, and then you had some bit more challenging hiking, and you had some more crossing, so there's a lot of kind of footwear changing. Now, there's almost no opportunities to charge anything on this trip because, as I say, it goes to quite remote areas. I mean, pretty much There's only about 1 or 2 villages that we camped at. The rest of the time, we're pretty much camping in the middle of nowhere. And so a solar charger, again, with the sunshine, solar charger worked really well. So I'm very glad I took that. And one thing I really enjoyed, slightly masochistically about this trip, was that there was the opportunity to have a wash almost every day, because where you're camping out, they obviously need to be near water supply for cooking and for the crew. And so I would go and have a dip or a wash in the stream. Now, when we're at kind of 3,500, 4,000 meters and it's sunny, it was kind of manageable. When you get into like close to 5,000 meters above sea level and maybe the sun's gone down, the water has come off the glaciers. It is freezing cold, literally freezing cold. But I'd go around the corner, go full nudie, I'd go full immersion, I'd even wash my hair, I'd kind of go full immersion in the stream. I can maybe last 10 seconds and then I'm jumping out, and it was quite invigorating, and it was a really good way of keeping clean. And it was really good also that I could wash clothes along the hike, because you're doing it in summer and it's sunny, and it's dry, things would actually dry pretty quickly. So that was quite useful. Whereas I can imagine, like hiking Bhutan, where it can often be quite damp in places, or you're not getting the sunshine, it can be cloudy. It's quite difficult to keep things clean along the way. But yeah, that was great. And I actually probably took too many clothes on that basis, because I didn't realize I'd be able to wash it as I went. Now, a buff is very useful. So it can be very dry, it can be quite dusty, particularly on the drives. It's just the nature of it. There's just a lot of kind of dust in the air. So having a buff just to wrap around your kind of nose and mouth can be quite useful there. Now, I got a SIM card. One thing to note is you can get eSIMs in India, and they work perfectly fine in Delhi and most parts of India. But in the border regions, because of sensitivities, they do not work. So you actually have to get a physical SIM card. And that was more challenging than it often is in most countries. We basically there was only one place in Leh that sold them. It was a 15-minute taxi ride away. The server went down. You had to provide with paperwork. And so it took a number of hours to get the SIM card. I'm glad I got it in the end, because probably about a third of the days on the hike, there was actually signal. So it was good to stay in touch with my wife. And for a month's internet, so 1.5 gigabytes per day, it cost 500 rupees, which is about $8 Australian, which is probably significantly cheaper than either you or mine's internet packages. So it was hard work to get, but it was good value once I got it.
Yeah, it's often the case, isn't it? You take it for granted that you're going to get internet access. And I think I mentioned to you when we were talking about Bhutan a while ago that there was good internet signal all the way through the mountains. We just didn't think about it, so didn't bother taking our phones with us. But yeah, at least there is an opportunity in what sounds like a very remote area. If you want to, you can actually get internet and phones. So.
And normally when I go tramping and hiking in New Zealand, for example, that's one of the things I appreciate, is being completely off the grid and having that sense of solitude. But when you're away from your wife for 3 weeks, it's quite nice to check in occasionally. So I kind of tried to moderate my use. And it wasn't like it was going to be fast. You're not going to be watching videos, but it's useful just to send a WhatsApp message saying, hey, I'm still alive. It's all going well.
Do you use a satellite communicator at all?
Now, interestingly, in India, you could not take drones. They were confiscated off you at the airport. You could not take satellite phones. You could not take PLB locator beacons. So India is quite strict on those things. And so, actually, I think the crew had something which was a little bit like a sat phone, but was allowed to be used. But yeah, those kind of devices, again, you're on the border between, you've got Pakistan, you've got China, you've got India. There's a lot of sensitivities. They don't want people wandering around with sat phones and drones. You'll get in trouble. So the crew did have a means of contacting people if they needed to in an emergency. And as I said, there was mobile phone network coverage for maybe a third of the way. But yeah, that's a peculiar or a specific thing about hiking up in Ladakh.
Yeah, I must admit I was aware that was the case with China, but I just hadn't thought about India, so it's interesting to know. All right, okay. Now,
because I've got a drone and I'm going to Hong Kong soon. And I thought, well, do I take it? Do I not take it? The rules sort of suggest maybe. And I have to say ChatGPT, you can use it for many things. And I asked ChatGPT, I said, should I take my drone to Hong Kong and mainland China? And it basically went, technically you can, but actually in reality, they're not going to be very happy with you doing that. And there's lots of restricted areas. So the opportunities to use a drone are pretty limited. And I was like, okay, That's useful because you can read something saying legally you can use a drone, but in reality it might be more challenging and not really worth the risk. So AI has got some benefits there.
Whipper is an Australian designer and manufacturer of ultralight packs based in the Blue Mountains town of Katoomba, and manufactures the best purpose-built performance packs for use in hiking, mountaineering, climbing and canyoning. Leveraging Australian design and manufacturing experience built up since 1981, Whipper uses the most advanced materials available with a minimalist approach that ensures every element serves a purpose. In doing so, they strip away the unnecessary to focus on what truly matters, which is functionality, durability, comfort and performance, to create packs that, in Whipper's words, are lighter, stronger and better. So if you want to experience your ultimate hiking adventure, then get yourself a Whipper Ultralight Performance Pack designed and built in Katoomba, Australia. Now, what was your accommodation on this trip? Was it mainly tents that were brought along that carried with the mules, or were you staying in some huts up from time to time?
Yeah, so the hiking infrastructure in Ladakh it's not like Nepal with tea houses. It is just camping, basically. So when we were in Leh, we had a nice hotel there. With the sort of one day's worth of kind of driving out before we sort of started the hike, and we were staying in a homestay, which my expectations have been set pretty low. Almost was like, expect basic. And then we get there and it had power, it had hot showers, I think it had Wi-Fi even. And so, that was quite nice. And I think he said, well, when he stayed there like the year before, they didn't have those things. So, things develop pretty quickly in some of these areas. But for the trip itself, it was all camping. Tents are really good, actually. They're probably some of the best tents I've used on a camping trip. Very spacious, and they also had a very large porch area. So I could basically put all my bags outside the tent and had lots of space inside the tent. And then they also bring a dining tent for you to have your meals in, and then a cooking tent for the crew. And then the crew would sleep in the kind of cooking tent generally to stay warm together.
That brings us back to just a question I didn't think about when we were talking about gear. Did you bring your own sleeping bag? And if so, what sort of rating did it have on it?
Yes, I brought my own sleeping bag. They do provide a foam mattress, which some of the group were happy sleeping on. I always take an inflatable mattress as well. And actually the foam was good because they say it's very rocky. So you don't really want to be putting your inflatable mattress necessarily on a rocky surface where there might be a risk of puncture. So it's quite useful having that kind of foam mattress, and then I put my inflatable on top of that. And I brought my own sleeping bag. I think it's rated down to -10. There were a few nights towards the end when things started getting high when, I needed that and I needed to kind of layer it properly. But most of the time I would kind of have it zipped open, or I'd just kind of sleep in the sleeping bag liner, kind of depending on the situation.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. It's one of these sort of things. I know a lot of companies will often provide sleeping bags if you ask them to, but typically they're not the world's best sleeping bags. And I think this is one of these items that's worthwhile bringing your own, so you know exactly how it's going to perform in a range of conditions.
Exactly. And it's not like you're going for a 3-day bushwalk or like travel. If you haven't got the right gear with you, you got to live with it for 2 to 3 weeks. So you want to, you're encouraged to take the stuff you actually need.
All right. And the all-important question, what was the food like?
Food was very good. It's always amazing what the cooks can rustle up in the middle of nowhere. Particularly the crew on this trip have been doing this trip for 10, 15 years. So every year they try and make improvements. The crew know kind of how it works. And so they're very well kind of suited to making decent meals. So you start generally in the morning with either porridge or cereal, followed by egg and toast. And then lunch, which I quite like this way, which I think Olmos, who leads this, and he also leads trips like the Snowman in Bhutan, he's really kind of pushes, is the lunch is made at kind of breakfast time, and then it's put in kind of heat, or sort of not Tupperware, but it's put in sort of thermos storage, food storage, so it stays warm. And then you have that at lunchtime, and it means you don't have to stop and cook. So I remember in Nepal, you'd end up having a 2-hour lunch break every day because the crew had to kind of cook everything from scratch for both the crew and for the guests. So I quite like the way that you just have a quick lunch, which gives you more options. If the weather's turning or something's happening, it gives you options. And so lunch, you'd normally have things like pasta and hard-boiled eggs and some beans and rice and potatoes. And then you'd probably have a similar kind of things for dinner, maybe a little bit fancier. And then you'd also have afternoon tea, so a packet of biscuits and a cup of tea or coffee.
Now, just going on My experience in the Himalayan region, does that mean that the crew and the staff followed along after they'd packed everyone's tents up and cleaned up the dishes and cooked lunch, overtake you during the daytime and then meet you at the campsite at the end of the day?
Correct. Yeah, that's exactly how it works. And even though you're got all the gear, got the poles, I'm storming along, they just wander past you in jandals at twice the speed. And
yeah, no, it's I think for a lot of the people in those areas, there is one speed, or there's two speeds. They're stopping really fast. Okay, now what about interaction with people on this trip? Now, the question I haven't asked you was how many people did you have on this trip, and males and females mix, or was it all guys doing the trip?
No, we had a bit of a mixture. So the group, the guests, so there were 5 of us. There was a British guy, an American guy, a Canadian couple, and myself. So one woman in the trip. And I'd done a previous trip with her before, actually, in Nepal. So it was really nice. Because the mountain company is a relatively small company, you tend to see familiar faces. So when I was in Nepal, actually a couple of months ago, to do a different trip, 2 of the people on that trip I'd hiked with before on another trip with the mountain company. And then when I was just having breakfast in the hotel, there was another person from another trip, because they always use the same hotel, the Ambassador Hotel in Kathmandu. So you're like, oh, I remember seeing you from the trip 3 years ago. So it's quite nice to kind of see some familiar faces. Nice little group of kind of 5, which is a good number. And we're all pretty decent kind of pace we were going at. And then there was a crew of 7. So you got almost who's the kind of lead, you got 2 guides, you got 2 cooks and 2 horsemen. And again, that's quite a nice size, because with 7 people, you can kind of get to know them. I found a little bit, when I did Kanchenjunga in Nepal, we would have had, I think there was 10 or 12 of us in the group, and then you suddenly get all the porters and you end up with a crew of 20 people, and then just trying to remember people's names is a bit more challenging. So it's quite nice to have a kind of close-knit kind of group of people. I mean, Ladakh itself is definitely getting busier than it used to be. So even, I think, compared to when I was there in 2019, traditionally Ladakh was very popular with French and Israeli tourists, both for kind of hiking. But during COVID, because obviously the borders were closed, Indians really started discovering their own country. And so that's when I probably went to Ladakh in 2019, there might have been half a dozen flights a day from Delhi, and now there's 15 flights a day. So it can get very busy in Leh and some other areas, but the areas we were going were pretty remote. We'd have days between seeing anybody, really.
Okay, so go through and talk us through a brief overview of what a typical day on trail looked like.
Yeah, so you'd get your hot water if you want that. So a cup of tea or coffee at sort of 6 o'clock, they'll come around to your tent. And then 7 a.m. breakfast, start hiking around 8, have lunch around noon, normally get to camp by kind of early afternoon. So we were typically doing kind of 10 to 15 kilometers a day, so maybe 5 to 7 hours walking, which is it's kind of like the ideal, I think. And you get in there by mid-afternoon, you have tea time at 3, 4 o'clock, you have dinner at 6, and then you're in bed by 7:30. I did the Manaslu circuit in Nepal, and there was because of the altitude and because you're staying in tea houses, and so you could only really stop where tea houses were, you'd end up with quite a lot of short days, and so you finished by 11:30, 12, which you just got quite a long time to be hanging around with not a lot to do. Like the first day or 2 is quite nice, you're off the grid, and then you're kind of like, okay, well, it'd be nice to have a few more things to do. So I find that kind of 5 to 7 hours is kind of a nice duration. There were some days which may be longer, maybe 8 or 9 hours, but that wasn't every day. So that was kind of a nice kind of pace to go at. And what I really appreciate about Almos and the mountain company, and because they tend to attract more experienced hikers, and also the nature of the landscape in Ladakh, which is no trees. So you can basically see everybody, or you can see people a couple of kilometers off. And so you can walk at your own pace. I see other groups, and I saw some Papua New Guinea as well on the Kokoda track. It's my nightmare is to be in a group where everybody's walking about 2 feet away from each other in a kind of army style kind of march, and everybody's kind of walking each other's footsteps. Like that just doesn't work for me at all. And so I really appreciate, and it's something which it's hard to get when you're looking at trips and operators. It's hard. It's not something that people may consider. And I think obviously the size of the group can make a difference, and also the kind of guiding style of the trip leader. And certainly for me, I really appreciate having the independence to basically kind of go at my own pace. And so some days I was a bit slower, and then some days I was a bit faster. And we could see the guy. There was always a guy behind me. There was a guide in front of me, and you felt safe, but you could go at a pace that feels comfortable. I find it quite hard if you're trying to walk slowly, or if you're stopping too often, especially if you're altitude and getting cold, or if you've got a fast pace and you're struggling to keep up, that's also a challenge. So that is something to consider, particularly if you're primarily an independent hiker. So probably like you, Tim, most of my hikes I do solo with my wife, and I've got freedom and it's self-organized. I do my own thing. So when you're doing a guided trip, yeah, there are pros because you get to go to places you would definitely not be able to go to unless you're with a group. But there's also some cons you need to kind of manage and mitigate as far as possible.
Okay. Now, what were the highlights of the trip for you?
So my 3 would be the sense of remoteness. So you're the only people in that valley. Like you might see the odd local yak herder, but you're pretty much by yourself. So it's quite hard to get that sense of remoteness in a lot of places now. Particularly, I found post-COVID, I don't know if you've seen this, but is hiking. Like that, there's been a massive hiking boom that happened during COVID and afterwards. And so trails that, like the Manasau circuit just in Nepal, in my mind, it was quite a quiet one and not many people knew about it. But my head was kind of pre-COVID, and the numbers pre-COVID were like 3,000 or 4,000 a year. And now it's 15,000 people a year. So it's really good to kind of get off to those kind of remote areas where it's still quite an adventure. As I mentioned earlier, it's a surprisingly varied hike. It's not just rocks. I mean, the rocks you see are pretty dramatic rock formations, but there's some green pastures, you see glaciers in the distance, there's some high passes, you've got some really narrow gorges, which are almost a bit like kind of Zion Canyon in the States, where it's really quite kind of narrow and atmospheric, and then you've got this kind of 30 or 40 river crossings. So every day was a little bit different. And then my third kind of highlight was both on the hike itself. We would stop at some, there's quite a lot of Buddhist kind of stupas and chortens and mani walls and candis, and then in the monasteries. So we visited probably at least half a dozen, maybe closer to 10 monasteries. And I really appreciate the kind of Buddhist culture. And a lot of these monasteries are very old. I've been to ones in other places which they look old, and you look afterwards and they're like it's 5 or 10 years old. But these monasteries are hundreds of years old, and to see the life of monks and nuns in those kind of places is a really kind of special experience for me.
Okay, and that brings us to the other side of things. Are there any negatives that, every trip has a negative, but what were the negatives for this trip?
Yeah, the main one for me was exposure risk. Now, that's because I don't like heights, which, so there was probably 2 or 3 days where there was quite significant exposure risk. And so what I'm talking about here is you might be walking along a sort of gorge canyon, and the track is, I don't know, 2 or 3 feet wide. It's not very wide. It's a person's width, effectively. And then you might have a 200-foot sheer drop to your left. And so rationally, there is no reason for me to fall off that. Like, the path is wide enough that I should be able to walk along that path, and it should be fine. I mean, that's what the locals use. I mean, the local kids are using it. You see locals, carrying kids, and they've got these, and they're doing it. And and the locals maintain the tracks because that's the way they get to their villages. So they're reasonably well maintained. But if you don't like heights and you've got a 200-foot drop off to your left, it's just exhausting. I found those days I would finish the day mentally and physically exhausted from the kind of stress, I guess, of the fear and the risk. And rationally, and also, I mean, the track, it's not got tree roots. Like, there's nothing there you should really be tripping up on. But it's, again, my brain is going, just one mistake and then I'm going to be in serious trouble. So that to me was the kind of major downside. The other people in the group, I was definitely at the end of really not liking exposure risk. One other person wasn't a big fan of it, but could kind of cope with it. And then the others were actually fine. So I think it really depends on what your experience and things has been to date. So that to me was the only real kind of negative.
Just when I think about it, in a lot of the cases with these sort of trips, there is a tipping culture in that part of the world. Was that the case with this trip as well?
Yes, but the mountain company will let you know before, this is the expectation around tipping, and you take this much money and then you divide it up, and there's a hierarchy in terms of, interestingly, the cooks always get paid as much as the lead guides because it's quite important, and then probably the horsemen might get a bit less. So it's because you've got a leader there, like a Western leader, almost as kind of Western and Indian at the same time. Like it's pretty straightforward. They let you know what you need to bring, and they sort out all the tips, and they work it out, and it's not a stressful thing. It's not like you have to think about, because if you do it if you hire your own guide and you're trying to work out yourself, it can be a little bit awkward about the ratios between different people in the crew. But yeah, that was not a problem at all. And it wasn't significant. Like the tipping, I don't know, maybe a couple $100. Like in the grand scheme of the cost of the trip, it wasn't kind of material.
No, that's fair enough. I think it's a bit of a surprise, particularly for Australians and probably New Zealanders as well, who aren't a tipping culture. If you're not aware of it for the first time you ever go to the Himalayas. And after doing this walk, who would you say this walk is suitable for?
This is probably not your first hike in the Himalaya. Let's put it that way. So you want to have some experience. If you've done, I'd done 2 or 3 in the Himalaya by that point, and it was fine. Especially if you're okay with exposure risk, that makes a big difference. Just because it's camping, it's remote. The toilet is a hole in the ground with a toilet tent around it. There's no accommodation really sort of once you get outside of Leh. So people are quite happy kind of. I guess roughing it by some people's standards, and experienced hiking in terms of the terrain. I think if you did the Larapinta, that's probably a pretty good warm up in terms of that kind of rocky kind of terrain. You need to be comfortable, which Australians probably generally are, with some heat. And we actually got lucky that we had a couple of hot days, and then it got a little bit cloudy, and it kind of cooled down a little bit, and then it was kind of fine. But certainly in Ladakh and also Pakistan, it can get hot, there's no shade, and you just need to be kind of comfortable with that environment, and also that kind of dry environment. If you've got any kind of sinus issues, then you'll feel it a little bit just with the dry air. And as I said, you'll visit lots of monasteries. So I love monasteries, I love Buddhism, I love everything about it. It was great. It's not for everybody. And so, some people, once you've seen a couple of monasteries, you feel like you've seen enough. And so this might just test your tolerance for monasteries if that's not your kind of thing. But I say you probably got maybe 3 or 4 days of the overall 23-day trip is quite kind of heavy in terms of monasteries and Buddhist sites, and then the rest of it is more just kind of pure hiking in wilderness kind of areas.
Okay. Now, final question: what's your next great hiking adventure?
So again, I'm probably going a bit off-piste. I'm going to Iraq, the obvious place to go and do a hike. So in April, I'm going to do a 215-kilometer 2-week hike. So in April, I'm doing a 215-kilometer 2-week hike in the Zagros Mountains in northern Iraq, which is in the Kurdistan region. Now, it's funny because it's one of these things. I think I saw an article somewhere on the internet about they were building this trail in Kurdistan to attract hikers. And so I sort of had an awareness of it. And then they've started running commercial trips. And I think this is only going to be the second commercial trip that they run. So this is a company called Untamed Borders, who I've not used before. They're one of these companies that if you want to go to Afghanistan or Syria or Libya or Yemen, then Untamed Borders are your kind of place. So they've got a lot of experience in the more obscure kind of tourist destinations of the world. And so I feel very comfortable going with them. They did first year was the first commercial trip. And so, they made some learnings from that. So, the second year is a good time to kind of do it because pretty much nobody has done this trail. But there is infrastructure in place. You basically, I think, staying at homestays. It connects about 30 different communities along the way. It goes past the highest mountain in Iraq. And the geologist in our group on the Ladakh Sky Trail, I don't think I even prompted. I think I sort of said about, your favorite mountains, or if he wanted to go and see something, he loves rock stuff. So, where's some of the best places in the world to see some interesting geology? And he said, unprompted, the Zagros Mountains. I was like, oh, well, I'm going there next year. I hadn't even known it was kind of geologically important. So it'll be interesting to see what that kind of landscape looks like. And again, I like the hiking. I think there'll be it's the physical challenge, but as much of that for this trip will be the culture. So I've spent a reasonable amount of time in the Middle East, and I've been to Iran, I've been to Syria and things. So it'll be fascinating to go to Iraq. I'm going to spend a week before doing the hike in federal Iraq. So I'm going to go to Baghdad. It's going to be an experience, I think, to kind of see something like that, which you've seen on the news a lot, and and all these kind of ancient sites, and Mosul, which got completely destroyed. So yeah, I think it's going to be a really fascinating trip, both culturally and from a hiking perspective. So maybe I can come back and talk about that next year.
No, definitely. It definitely sounds like an interesting one. Okay, so we've been talking with Jonty Crane about hiking the Ladakh Sky Trail in northern India. Jonty, thanks for taking the time to fill us in about this undiscovered destination.
Always a pleasure. Thank you for your time, Tim.
So that was our interview with Jonty Crane on the little-known Ladakh Sky Trail in northern India. Jonty has a bit of a habit of doing these out-of-the-ordinary sort of hikes. And again, there's just so many amazing hikes we don't hear about. So it's a good chance to have a chat to him to find out what he's been up to and what he's done. In relation to the interview itself, there were a couple of things that really stood out to me that's worthwhile just reinforcing again. He's saying that the area in Ladakh only gets around about 10 centimetres of rain a year, which is very much classed as a desert environment, as he said, but it does get snow during wintertime. He also made the comment in relation to the trails that were once trails are now busy roads. And we found that when we did our trip to Bhutan a number of years ago, the trails that we were using really were the trails that the locals are using to walk from village to village. And as Jonty mentioned during the interview, they really do tend to move very quickly. And we found that they had two speeds, which was stop and flat out. Doesn't seem to be anything in between. And I know on our trip in Bhutan, they would leave home at 3 o'clock in the morning, go back to the town they were heading to, turn around and come back again and be home by sort of 10 o'clock at night, travelling something that we as hikers would probably take 3 days to do. So it's the sort of trip that from year to year, the trip itself may actually change because the roads are being put in place and the organiser of the trip is trying to give people the best experience by going not on a walking road or a road, but going onto a trail to give people a bit more of a natural experience. As he mentioned, there was two travel companies that he did mention on this trip. One was the mountain company who organised this trip, and it seems to be this is a trip that they've put together, and he's used them for a number of his adventures in the Himalayan region. And we've got the link to their company and this particular trip in the show notes. This trip is 23 days in length. Costs approximately $7,500 with basically everything included: food, tents, accommodation, and the rest of the stuff that come with that. Flights, he indicated, were roughly around about $2,000 return from Australia, and they can certainly be more expensive than that depending on which airline you travel with. And also something we did mention as well was the tipping culture. So there is an expectation that you do tip the crew, which is approximately around about another $200. One thing that didn't surprise me, I asked the question, what were the animal life like on this trail? And I did have a view in my mind that this would be limited. And sure enough, he said really the things he tends to see was marmots, and he saw them a couple of times, and the blue sheep, which tend to be common throughout the Himalayas, and also yaks as well. These really were about the extent of it. And he did mention that companies will often mention seeing snow leopards, but he said, look, that's a really a rare thing that you'll have, and it can't be guaranteed. The other thing that's a bit unique about this hike as well is that Jonty was saying that he took a solar charger as far as hikes go. And the reason for this is a 23-day trip where you're not really going to have access to power points that often. You might get away with taking a power bank for a short period, but once it runs out, you've got no way to recharge it. And he was saying he took a solar charging panel with him. And again, that's where you can join that up with a battery pack. charge your main battery, and then feed it off into your other pieces of gear, your camera or your phone, whatever the case may be. So this is something that I'm not really used to, and usually you can actually go and charge from time to time in places on when the trips are a bit shorter. The other thing that's a bit different about this area is he said really he's used to using eSIMs, but they don't work in the Ladakh border region, and getting a local SIM was quite time-consuming. And he mentioned that normally what should have been a quicker process, the computer systems were down, and it ended up taking a number of hours to actually get a SIM card. Now, in most cases, most hikers probably wouldn't care too much about having access to a SIM card, but I think in this sort of situation, he said there were access from time to time to phone, more so than the internet, and you could send a text message. So if you've got someone back at home and you just want to touch base every so often and say, look, all's going well, we're on track, that's probably more the reason for carrying it. It's something to keep in mind. I asked if he took a personal locator beacon or a satellite communicator, and basically, because this is a bit of a contentious border area between Pakistan, China and India, that satellite communicators and personal locator beacons aren't allowed. And he said drones as well, but he said if you turn up to the airport with a drone, they'll take it off you in India. So this is limited. So really you've got to rely on the company you're going with to have access to phones, which they will do, to be able to contact from time to time if something does go wrong. He talked about bringing a minus 10 degree sleeping bag. That's probably a bit more than I would ever use in Australia, except in alpine conditions. But you've got to take a sleeping bag that's going to take into account the worst possible conditions. And I think he said in one night he was wearing virtually all his clothing as well as the sleeping bags. So really it's one of these sort of things that you can hire or loan a sleeping bag, but really when trying to get a good night's sleep, it's worthwhile having something small and compact and good quality, and that often means bringing your sleeping bag with you. The highlights he mentioned for this trip was the sense of remoteness, surprisingly varied with green pastures and dramatic rock formations. And if you go to the show notes for this podcast on the Australian Hiker website, you'll see some really amazing images. So very different to the Swiss Alps, very different from other parts of the Himalayas and even in South America and the Andes. It's some amazing looking scenery. And I think from my perspective, it would be worthwhile going just to see that scenery alone. The other key thing for him was the Buddhist sites, the Buddhist monasteries. Now, as he said, you either like them or you don't, and once you've seen 3 or 4 or 5, you may not want to see more. But they're spectacular sort of monasteries in general in the Himalayas, and definitely if you're into historic and cultural aspects, they're definitely worthwhile looking at. The negatives of this trip, and really for him there was probably only one, and this is something that you will need to consider if what he described is you. And he said he doesn't like heights. He said when you're walking along a trail that's only 3 foot wide and then you've got a 200-metre drop off to the side, he said even though it's a good trail, there's no tree roots to trip over, I must admit I'd be thinking the same thing as well, that if I wasn't paying attention, I'd trip over my own feet. But he said he was the worst out of the group. He said one other person wasn't as bad and the others didn't seem to mind. And the locals certainly travel this fairly regularly without any problem. But if you do have a fear of heights, potentially the Himalayas may not be a place that worthwhile going to. And as he mentioned, we talked to him about where he's heading to next year, and he talked about going to the Zagros Mountains in northern Iraq in the Kurdistan region. Now, this again is not a typical sort of hike, and he's going with a company called Untamed Borders. And this is a company that actually specialises in going to remote and out of the way and potentially contentious areas. So if you want something really adventurous, then this is a potential as well. And we certainly will interview him sometime late next year once he's done the trip, just to see how it goes. We hope you've enjoyed the podcast episode on the Ladakh Sky Trail. For me, this is something a bit rarer, a bit more remote. And if you want to get out of the rat race and not have lots of people and have a fairly secluded sort of experience, this is certainly a good way to go. That's all for this episode, brought to you by Whipper Packs, Australia's pack manufacturers. Bye for now.